As Germany was growing more and more into a fascist state in the second half of the 1930s, many countries in Europe started to make preparations to defend themselves against the aggression that was due to come. Belgium also had its concerns on the rhetoric coming from their eastern neighbor, but politics still held strongly on the country's stance of neutrality and did not want to invest into modernizing its military forces, despite concerns outed by the military high command. Following exercises conducted by the Belgian Aeronautique Militaire in 1937 and 1938, it was clear that the aerial defenses and strike capabilities were something left to be desired, as the larger part of its fleet was too slow and/or outdated to function properly against any potential threat. In an attempt to upgrade its aircraft fleet, Belgium bought 22 Gloster Gladiator Mark Is from Britain in 1936 to boost its air defenses. 15 aircraft were built by Gloster in the UK, while a further 7 aircraft were planned to be built under license by Sapka, plus potential additional aircraft. But an agreement with Gloster was never reached, and only 15 UK-built examples entered service. But the Gladiators were rapidly becoming outdated and too few in numbers to be effective, and more was needed. As a result, a deal was reached with Hawker, with an order for 95 Hawker Hurricane Mark Is in 1938. The first 15 aircraft were built in Britain, while the other 80 were to be built under license in Belgium by Avion Ferry in Gosselies, the Belgian subsidiary of British Ferry Aviation Company. These would replace the outdated Ferry Foxes, of which the Aeronautique Militaire received over 200 of, in different variants between 1931 and 1939. But the setting up of the licensed production for the Hurricanes was not going as well as hoped, and encountered delays. The first license-built aircraft wasn't delivered until May 9, 1940. By that time, it was the beginning of 1939, and the threat of war was becoming more of a question of when, rather than if, it would happen. The newly appointed commander of the Aeronautique Militaire, General Major Paul Hiernaut, ordered a large-scale modernization of its fleet, and as a result, a number of delegations were sent abroad to acquire new aircraft. In April 1939, a first delegation was sent on a mission to one of the biggest suppliers for most European nations, the United States of America. With its large aircraft industry uninterrupted by the threat of war in Europe, the Americans were more than eager to sell their aircraft to foreign customers, albeit subject to some export restrictions on sensitive technology. Upon arrival, it was hoped that the delegation would have discussions with the Curtiss Company and join the French and purchase a number of Curtiss Hawk 75s, an export variant of the P-36 that was being built and in service with the United States Army Air Corps. However, as production was already fully booked with hundreds of orders from France, Britain and other customers, they were unable to sell the aircraft to the Aeronautique Militaire at the moment, so they had to look elsewhere. Reluctantly, they went with one of the only other aircraft that was still available, the Brewster Buffalo, and placed an order for 40 aircraft. The Buffalo was not exactly a good aircraft. In fact, it was later known to be one of the worst aircraft of World War II. The aircraft had some serious performance issues and design flaws, the biggest being the tendency that the engine would overheat due to lack of air cooling, as a result of how the cowling was designed. But with war looming, the Belgians would take anything they can get their hands on. The export version of the Buffalo for Belgium, known as the Brewster B.694, was a denavalized version of the F2A-2 variant that was in service with the US Navy. The original F2As were equipped with a 1200 horsepower 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone radial engine, but due to export restrictions, this was swapped out for a lower-powered civilian version that produced 200 horsepower less. The arrestor hook was removed for land-based operations, along with the life raft behind the pilot's seat. Armor plating around the cockpit was also removed and replaced with sheets of plywood to make the aircraft lighter to compensate for the lower engine power. The first 2 Buffaloes for the Aeronautique Militaire left the Brewster plant in Newark, New York in April 1940 and arrived by ship in the port of Bordeaux in France in June. However, as events unfolded by the time they arrived, Belgium was defeated and the Battle of France was still ongoing, and the 2 aircraft, still created, ended up in enemy hands and were sent back to Germany for evaluation. At the same time, 6 more Buffaloes were en route to Bordeaux on board the French aircraft carrier Béarn. After the fall of Belgium, the aircraft were transferred to France, but still wore its Belgian military markings. When the news came in that France surrendered, the ship changed course for the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. There, the Buffaloes, along with other aircraft that were destined for the French Armée de l'Air and Air Naval, were unloaded and placed in open storage on a hillside by the coast, where they stayed until the end of the war and then eventually sold for scrap. The 32 remaining Brewster Buffaloes fared better. After the French surrender in June 1940, they were transferred to the Royal Air Force. Here, they had their Belgian markings painted over and received British roundels and serials, and were sent to RAF squadrons in Southeast Asia. But the Brewster Buffalo wasn't the only fighter the Belgians bought in the United States. There was also another fighter that was ordered to increase their aircraft numbers: the Grumman G36A. The Grumman G36A was an export version of one of the best carrier-based aircraft in the first years of the war, the Grumman F4F Wildcat, and was also ordered by Britain, France and Greece. Belgium ordered at least 10 G36As, although the exact numbers are unknown. It is likely they were ordered to replace the Gloucester Gladiators in service with the Aeronautique Militaire. The G36A for export was largely based on the F4F-3 variant of the Wildcat, but in a somewhat downgraded version due to US imposed restrictions. One of the biggest changes was the engine. Originally, the Wildcat was equipped with a 1200 horsepower 14-cylinder Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp radial engine with a 2-stage supercharger, but was not allowed to be exported. These were replaced with a 1200 horsepower 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone engine with a single-stage 2-speed supercharger. Other modifications were that the wing folding mechanism was removed, and that the cockpit instruments, at least for the French and the Belgian G36s, were shown in metric values rather than imperial as used by the British and the Americans. Other changes were that the American radios and gun sights have been replaced by French versions. The Belgian G36As were likely to have received the same modifications as the aforementioned Brewster Buffaloes, being the removal of the tailhook and life raft as they were to be land-based. However, when Belgium was defeated on the 28th of May 1940, not a single G36 for the Aeronautique Militaire was completed, and the order was subsequently transferred to France for use with the French Navy, the Aéronaval, and the tailhook and life raft were reinstalled. But after the French surrender, these were then transferred to Britain. Here they entered service with the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm and were redesignated as the Martlet Mark I. Another fighter type rumoured to be ordered or looked at by the Belgian Aeronautique Militaire was the Bell P400, a modified version of the P-39 Era Cobra destined for use with the Royal Air Force. However, I have found no information about any order taking place, and I am presuming this information is false. If you have any information regarding a possible Belgian P400 orders, please leave a comment. But fighters were not the only aircraft the Belgians were looking for. Bombers were also on that list. Together with the French, the Aeronautique Militaire went with the Douglas DB7A and placed an order for 16 aircraft to replace the sluggish and underpowered Ferry Battle in the bomber role. The DB7A was a twin-engine medium bomber and reconnaissance aircraft with a payload of about 2,000 pounds or 910 kilos. In the duration of the war, the DB7 later evolved into one of the most successful aircraft in US Army Air Corps and later US Army Air Force service, the A-20 Havoc, or as it is known in the Royal Air Force service as the Boston. The aircraft was a real jack of all trades, serving not only as a bomber but also as a reconnaissance aircraft, an attack aircraft for day and night operations, and even have a night fighter version, the P-70. The Belgian DB7As were to be similar to those ordered by the French, and were to be equipped with a pair of 1600 horsepower 14-cylinder Wright Twin Cyclone radial engines. However, when the first aircraft for Belgium was completed at Douglas's plant in El Segundo, California, the country had already fallen, and the aircraft were transferred to the Royal Air Force. Unfortunately, no pictures of the DB7 in Belgian colours are known to be in existence. This particular aircraft shown here, serial AE458, was one of the DB7As that was part of the Belgian order. In RAF service, the aircraft were renamed as the Boston Mark I. And that about sums up the aircraft that were ordered in the United States. But this video is not finished yet. As noted earlier, there were multiple delegations sent abroad. The second one was led by General Hiernaut himself. And we now look at the aircraft that were purchased in Europe, beginning with our neighbours to the south, France. Belgium has always kept good relations with France. especially as it was one of the biggest buyers of French-built military equipment, although that mostly refers to those used by the ground forces. The Belgian army bought mostly mobile artillery, tanks and aircraft engines from the French. But in terms of aircraft itself, it always looked at British and domestic companies for its military aviation needs, despite the best efforts of the French to sell its Bloch and Detroitin fighters to the Aeronautique Militaire. All that changed in 1939, as the Belgians needed lots of new combat aircraft, and just like the US, the French were more than eager to sell. Finally, they got lucky, as there was interest in one of its more modern planes, the Breguet BR694. The Aeronautique Militaire placed an order for 32 Breguet BR694 A3B2s. These were to be used primarily as a reconnaissance aircraft, but would also have a secondary attack role. They would be replacing the ferry battles in that field and operate in the same unit alongside the aforementioned Douglas DB7s. The first aircraft was purchased in France in mid-1939, and 31 other aircraft would be built under license in Belgium by Mk.I, as the company was already building similar aircraft, the BR693, for the French Armée de l'Air at the time. The BR694 was a 2-seat or 3-seater reconnaissance aircraft, and it was an improved variant of the Breguet BR693 ground attack fighter, and shared the same fuselage and engines of the latter. It was powered by a pair of 700 horsepower 14-cylinder Numron 14M-6 radial engines, combined with a 3-blade variable pitch propeller. Its armament was also considerably lighter than that of the 693 variant, as the 20mm Hispano cannon in the nose was removed to make room for camera equipment. For self-defense, the aircraft would have mostly relied on its 7.5mm Mk.I machine guns in the rear gunner station and in the nose, but these would probably have been replaced with Belgian-made 7.62mm FN Browning machine guns. Unfortunately, no BR694s were delivered to the Aeronautique Militaire by the 10th of May 1940, when the Mk.I factory was bombed by the Luftwaffe in the opening hours of the German invasion. All BR693s that were being built for the French were destroyed in the raid, as well as the possibility to build the BR694 under license. The first French-built prototype of the BR694 was rolled out in Tours in June 1940, but it suffered damage in a heavy landing incident, and its fate is unknown. Most likely it was destroyed when the Germans invaded France. Another aircraft the Belgians showed interest in was the Polish-built PZL-37 which is Polish for Moose. This twin-engine medium bomber was already being built in Belgium under license by Renard on behalf of PZL to fulfill an order for the Spanish Republican Air Forces, who ordered 20 to 50 aircraft in 1938. When the Spanish Civil War ended in early April 1939, the defeated Spanish Republican forces were dissolved, and their order for the PZL-37 was cancelled. However, an unknown number of aircraft were in various stages of production at Renard, and it was been noted that the Belgian Aeronautique Militaire wanted to take over some of those aircraft. However, none of them were finished before the invasion, and it remains uncertain if the Aeronautique Militaire actually bought these aircraft, let alone that production continued after the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939. The last stop of the delegation was Italy. By that time it was December 1939, and Germany just invaded Poland, and it was obvious that the rest of Europe were to be the next victims of the Blitzkrieg. The Italians were not aligned with the Germans yet at the time, and the local industry was known to be able to produce aircraft at a rapid pace. Aside from the 40 Fiat CR42s that were ordered, of which 30 were delivered by the time of the invasion, there was also an order for 24 Caproni CA312 observation aircraft. The Caproni CA312 was a twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft and secondary light bomber, developed on the basis of the CA310. If you have seen my previous video on the Sapka S47, you might remember that Caproni made a license deal with Sapka in 1937 to have the CA312 built in Belgium. It is likely that the Belgian CA312s were to enter service under the designation of Sapka S48. Specifications on the Belgian ordered aircraft are a bit unclear. It's not clear if these were to be fitted with the old 493 horsepower 7-cylinder Piaggio Stella P7 radial engines that were also fitted on the underpowered CA310 and CA311, or the newer 770 horsepower Isotta Fraccini Delta V12 inverted inline engines that were also fitted on the newer CA313. The aircraft were expected to be delivered between June and July 1940, but unfortunately, as mentioned many times earlier in this video, the German invasion in May of that year put an end to those plans. And that about sums up the aircraft that the Belgian Aeronautique Militaire would have operated if the Battle of the Low Countries would have taken place a few months later, allowing these aircraft to be delivered. Would they have made the outcome of the battle any different? In my honest opinion, being realistic, in best case the Belgians would have kept the air war going maybe a few weeks longer, putting up an effective resistance against the German invaders. But in the end, the Luftwaffe would still have the upper hand, especially considering the overwhelming numbers of aircraft, the tactics and combat experience they have obtained over time. So the end result would have been the same, only delaying the inevitable.